Let me ask specifically about commerce. What are some of the issues that arise over the federal government's and the state government's regulation of commerce?
Going all the way back to the founding, there was a great question of whether or not commerce fell within the scope of the congressional authority over interstate commerce or within state authority to regulate intrastate commerce. And those clashes produced some of the great landmark decisions early in our history. The Supreme Court, in important opinions by Chief Justice Marshall, provided an expansive view of the interstate commerce clause possessed by Congress, often to the disappointment of states who had hoped to wield more authority. And essentially what the court has said is that if an item moves across state boundaries, then that tends to fall into the category of interstate commerce and thus regulated by Congress. If an activity is solely located within a state, doesn't cross state boundaries, then it's left to the state's regulation of commerce. But in this time and place, there are very few economic or commercial ventures that don't move across state lines, thus implying that the ability or power of states to regulate commerce have been shrinking steadily.
Can you talk for a moment about the history of grant and aid programs and their use by the federal government to control state policy?
The grant and aid program has varied widely depending on which party is in power and their view toward how allocation of federal resources ought to be granted to the various states. Essentially, there's been a tussle between those who want Congress to legislate more specifically attaching strings to the allocation of money versus those at a state level who want broader latitude in deciding how to spend the monies.
We always hear about laboratories of democracy. States are the laboratories of democracy. So can you give us some examples of social or economic or political experiments in states that have been successfully implemented elsewhere in other states?
Sure. Good example early in our history, in the early part of the 20th century, involves social welfare programs such as aid to indigents, protection for children against laws that would permit or require them to work, the opportunity for collective bargaining and state subsidies to farmers and others in the agricultural industry. Those were programs established at the state level, which then allowed other states to decide whether or not they would embrace them or go down their own path. More recently, in the 1990s, as the nation was moving away for a time from the concept of welfare to workfare, we found the state of Wisconsin leading the way in trying to establish a program which provided more opportunities in the area of education and job training as a way of trying to remove people from the welfare list. It didn't go far enough or didn't last long enough because of a scarcity of resources.
How does the initiative, referendum, and recall processes reflect the principle of popular sovereignty, and do they also at the same time undermine the concept of representative democracy?
Those three tools are powerful tools for the American people to participate in the legislative process. At the time of the founding, the concept of out-of-doors legislation was a very powerful concept, meaning that citizens would not be left behind if, in fact, their legislative representatives were reluctant to embrace their views, to push forward with their programs and their desired policies. And so essentially, those were viewed as tools to hold government responsive and accountable. There's no great surprise that members of legislatures across the country are not particularly big fans of initiatives and referendums and certainly recall because it trims their sails, it undermines their powers. But I think that those tools are very important as a means of expressing the views of the people and promoting and ensuring the very doctrine of popular sovereignty, which is the cornerstone of America.
Mr. Adler, we've been very fortunate to have you with us today to discuss Unit 4. Thank you for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks very much.
I want to thank our guest, David Adler, for giving us this wonderful discussion of Unit 4 of the We the People text. I hope you have found it useful, and I hope you will join us for the 5th program of this series, which will focus on Unit 5, which discusses the rights protected by the Bill of Rights.